The notary looked at me across her desk, then looked back down at the signature on the loan modification form, then back at me again. "Ms. Carver," she said slowly, "this is your signature on the original deed of trust, correct?" I leaned in to look. My name, my handwriting, or something very close to it, except I had never signed that document in my life. That was the moment I understood that the woman my father had married 8 months earlier hadn't just inserted herself into our family. She had been systematically dismantling everything I thought was mine. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to February, because that's when it all started. Wet, gray, miserable February in Clover Ridge, the little planned community 20 minutes outside of Columbus, where I'd lived for the past 9 years. I moved to Clover Ridge when I was 33, right after my divorce from my first husband, Neil. I'd needed a reset, and the subdivision delivered exactly what I was looking for: quiet streets, decent neighbors who kept mostly to themselves, and a small 2-bedroom house with a covered porch that I could actually afford on a single income. I'm a CPA. I've worked at the same mid-size accounting firm, Hartwell & Dunn, for 16 years. I know how money moves, where it hides, and what people do when they're desperate to make the numbers look better than they are. I've spent my entire career catching those things for other people. What I never expected was to spend a year catching them for myself. By the time February rolled around, I was 42 years old, settled into a life that was quiet but genuinely mine. No drama, no debt, a decent 401k, and a house that had appreciated about $60,000 since I'd bought it. My mornings were coffee on that covered porch even in February, bundled in a fleece blanket, watching the sleet come down on the cul-de-sac while I scrolled through my emails. My evenings were spreadsheets, occasionally a glass of wine, sometimes a video call with my best friend Petra, who lived in Denver and worked in healthcare administration. We'd been friends since college, and she was the kind of person who could read my face through a phone screen and immediately say, "Okay, what happened?" My father, Gerald Carver, was 68. He'd been a widower for 11 years. My mother, Diane, died of pancreatic cancer when I was 31, which is one of those losses that restructures you permanently. Dad lived about 40 minutes away in a ranch house in Westerville that he and my mother had owned since 1987. He was mostly healthy, a little forgetful, still drove himself everywhere, and had a habit of calling me on Sunday mornings to talk about nothing in particular for 45 minutes. I looked forward to those calls. They were steady, predictable, safe. That February, the calls started getting shorter. I noticed it first on the second Sunday of the month. We talked for maybe 15 minutes, and when I asked if everything was okay, he said, "Oh, sure, honey, I've just got someone coming over for lunch." I didn't push. Dad was sociable. He'd had a rotating cast of friends from his church group and his old work buddies for years. Someone coming over for lunch was not unusual. The following Sunday, same thing. Shorter call, something vague at the end. This time he mentioned a name. "Roxanne's been helping me get the gutters sorted out," he said. "You know how I've been putting that off." I did know. The gutters had been on his to-do list for 2 years. "Roxanne who?" I asked. "Oh, she's a neighbor of Dave's. We met at his Christmas thing. She's very capable," he said, and then changed the subject to my tax season workload, which was already brutal by mid-February. I filed the name away without much concern. Roxanne. A capable neighbor of Dave's, Dave being his old colleague from the Department of Transportation, where Dad had worked for 26 years before retiring. It didn't ping any alarm in me. I was deep in Q1 chaos at the firm, working 10-hour days, and my brain simply did not have room for anything that wasn't a balance sheet. So I let it go. And that was my first mistake. March came and the sleet turned to mud season, which in central Ohio is its own special kind of miserable. Brown everywhere, the yards in Clover Ridge looking like they'd given up, the neighborhood kids tracking everything inside. I had 2 client audits running simultaneously, and I was surviving on gas station coffee and sheer spite. Dad and I talked on Sundays, but the calls kept drifting shorter. He sounded fine, happy even, a little distracted. It was Petra who first said out loud what I hadn't let myself think. We were on a video call in late March, and I was venting about work, and somewhere in the middle of it I mentioned that Dad seemed different lately, lighter, more distracted, a little cagey when I asked about his week. "Is he seeing someone?" Petra asked. I stared at her. "My dad is 68. That's not an answer, Nadia." She was right, it wasn't. "I don't know," I said. "He mentioned a woman named Roxanne a few weeks ago, but he said she was just helping with the gutters." Petra gave me a look that I recognized. It was the same look she'd given me in 2019 when I'd told her that Neil working late 4 nights a week was probably just a busy period. "Right," she said. "The gutters." I told myself it was fine. Dad deserved to be happy. He'd been alone for 11 years. If he'd found a friend, even a close friend, that was a good thing. I repeated this to myself with the practiced calm of a woman who has learned to manage anxiety by turning it into a spreadsheet item she can deal with later. The first time I actually met Roxanne was the last Saturday in April. Dad had invited me to lunch at his house. He made his chili, which was a significant event in our family, the recipe unchanged since roughly 1994. I drove up from Clover Ridge, parked in the driveway, walked in through the unlocked front door calling his name, and found a woman standing at my mother's kitchen counter slicing cornbread. She was 54, I later found out, trim, highlighted blonde hair, wearing a coral cardigan and earrings that were a little too dressy for a Saturday chili lunch. She smiled at me before I could process what I was seeing, and the smile was wide and practiced and showed a lot of teeth. "You must be Nadia," she said. "Your dad talks about you constantly. I'm Roxanne." I said something polite. I don't even remember what. Dad came in from the backyard a moment later, and the way he looked at her, relieved almost, like he'd been nervous about this introduction, told me everything Petra had suspected. Lunch was fine on the surface. Roxanne was charming in a way that required effort to observe. She asked me questions about my work, seemed genuinely interested in accounting of all things, laughed at the right moments, and refilled everyone's water glass before anyone asked. She called my dad Jerry, which no one had ever called him. He'd been Gerald his whole life, or Dad, or Mr. Carver, not Jerry. But he didn't correct her. He smiled every time she said it. I drove home with a low-grade unease that I couldn't entirely justify. She'd been perfectly pleasant. Dad was clearly happy. I had no reason to object to any of it. But that night I sat on my porch in the dark, listening to the April rain, and I thought about the way she'd moved through his kitchen, not like a guest, like someone who knew where everything was kept, like someone who had already decided it was hers. 6 weeks later, my father called me on a Tuesday evening, not a Sunday, a Tuesday, and told me he and Roxanne were getting married. They'd been together, apparently, since November. 5 months. He said it quickly, like he'd rehearsed it and needed to get through it before he lost his nerve. "She makes me feel like myself again," he said. "I hope you'll give her a chance, honey." I said I would. I meant it, even. The wedding was small, a courthouse ceremony in June, a dinner at a restaurant in Westerville with about 20 people I mostly didn't know. Roxanne's adult son Cody was there, 29, quiet, with the kind of stillness that could mean either shyness or calculation. I didn't know which yet. Her sister came up from Cincinnati, a few of Dad's church friends. Me, seated next to Petra, who had driven in from the airport that morning because she knew I shouldn't be alone at this thing. "She's watching you," Petra murmured at one point, leaning close. "Everyone watches the daughter at these things," I said. "Not like that," Petra said, "like she's measuring something." I looked over. Roxanne was laughing at something my dad had said, her hand on his arm, the coral and gold dress she'd chosen catching the restaurant light. She didn't appear to be watching me at all. But Petra had good instincts, better than mine, historically. I flew through the summer in the ordinary way, busy season cooling off slightly, a few weekend projects on the house, a trip to see Petra in Denver in August. Dad and Roxanne settled into the Westerville house, and the Sunday calls resumed, but now there was background noise on his end. Roxanne's voice sometimes, the television on a different channel than he used to watch. Small things. In September, Dad mentioned casually that Roxanne had suggested they look into simplifying the finances, combining accounts, reviewing the beneficiaries on his life insurance, that kind of thing. He said it like it was a routine errand, like getting the oil changed. "She's very organized," he told me. "Good with paperwork." I felt something shift behind my sternum, something cold and specific. "Dad," I said carefully, "have you talked to your attorney about any of that?" "Oh, we don't need to make a whole production out of it," he said. "It's just housekeeping." I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in my Clover Ridge house listening to the September wind work its way through the window seals, staring at the ceiling, running numbers in my head that I didn't have enough information to complete. I'd spent 16 years as an accountant. I knew what simplifying finances meant when someone new entered the picture. I knew what good with paperwork could cover. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was projecting my own control issues onto a situation that wasn't mine to manage, that my father was a grown man who had raised me, kept a marriage for 34 years, and navigated the world competently for 68 years without my supervision. I almost convinced myself. Then, in early October, I drove up to Westerville to drop off some papers Dad had asked me to notarize, a simple thing, a routine favor I'd done for him a dozen times over the years. I let myself in with my key, and Roxanne was there alone. "Dad was at a doctor's appointment," she said. She seemed surprised to see me. Maybe more than surprised. On the kitchen table, half covered by a dish towel as if someone had set it down quickly, was a manila folder. I could see the edge of a document sticking out. I recognized the font on the header. It was from the title company that had handled the original mortgage on the Westerville house, the one my parents had bought together in 1987, the one that was supposed to be part of my father's estate. Roxanne moved to the counter, asked if I wanted coffee, positioned herself between me and the table in a way that might have been coincidental. It wasn't coincidental. I was sure of that much. I just didn't know yet what I was sure of. I took the coffee. I don't know why, some reflex of politeness that my mother had drilled into me so thoroughly that it apparently survived even the moment I suspected her replacement of forging documents. I sat down at the kitchen table, wrapped both hands around the mug, and watched Roxanne move around the counter with the comfortable efficiency of someone who had already stopped performing and started inhabiting. The folder was still there, half under the dish towel. She didn't move it. Neither did I. We talked about nothing for 20 minutes. The weather turning, whether Dad's appointment was just a routine checkup or something more. She asked about my drive up from Clover Ridge and whether I'd hit construction on 270. She was good at this, the smooth, continuous surface of pleasant conversation, no seams, no gaps where anything uncomfortable could get in. I matched her pace, smiled when she smiled, answered her questions with just enough detail to seem at ease. Inside, I was photographing everything. The folder, the title company header, the fact that she'd been alone in the house with it, the way she'd positioned herself between me and the table, casual, almost theatrical in how casual it was. I'd spent 16 years reviewing documents that were designed to look routine. I knew the difference between a person who was comfortable and a person who was performing comfort. When Dad got home 40 minutes later, I notarized what he'd asked me to notarize. A simple power of attorney update, nothing alarming on its own, and I left. I hugged him at the door, told him the chili had been great even though we hadn't had any, and drove the 40 minutes back to Clover Ridge with my hands steady on the wheel and my mind running calculations I didn't have enough data to finish yet. That night I called Petra. She had a title company document on the table, I said, from the original lender on the Westerville house. "How do you know it was from the original lender?" "Because I was there when my parents refinanced in 2003. I remember the header. I was 23 and Dad asked me to drive him to the closing because Mom had a migraine." I paused. "Petra, that house has been paid off since 2018. There's no reason for a title company document to be sitting on their kitchen table." The silence on her end was the kind that meant she was thinking, not disagreeing. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'm going to find out what was in that folder." I didn't find out in October. October came and went, and I watched from a distance the way you watch a weather system you can't do anything about yet. Dad seemed fine, happy even. He mentioned once that they were looking at some options for the house, but didn't elaborate. And when I asked what kind of options, he said, "Oh, just financial planning stuff. Roxanne's got a guy she works with." And my stomach dropped about 6 inches. "What guy?" I asked. "A financial advisor. Name's Dwight something. Very sharp, apparently." I asked for the full name, and Dad said he'd get it for me, and then the conversation moved on, and he never did, and I didn't push hard enough, and that was my second mistake. November was when things started moving faster than I could track them. Dad mentioned they'd taken out a home equity line of credit, $75,000, to do some updates on the house and maybe help Cody get on his feet. Roxanne's son, Cody, 29 years old, quiet, with that unreadable stillness I'd clocked at the wedding. Getting $75,000 of my father's equity to get on his feet. I sat with that number for a long time. $75,000. The Westerville house was worth maybe $380, $390 at current market. There was no mortgage, so the equity was substantial, and now $75,000 of it was moving somewhere, through some financial advisor named Dwight, toward a 29-year-old man I'd met once. I drove up to Westerville the second Saturday in November without calling ahead. I told myself I was just stopping by. I told myself it was a casual visit. I parked down the block and sat in my car for a full 3 minutes, talking myself out of turning around, then walked up to the house and rang the bell instead of using my key. Roxanne answered. "Dad was at Dave's," she said, "watching a game." "I actually wanted to talk to you," I said. I heard my own voice, level, pleasant, 16 years of client meetings. "Do you have a few minutes?" She let me in. We sat in the living room, my mother's living room, the same couch, though the throw pillows were different now, coral and cream instead of the navy ones Mom had loved. I noticed it and filed it away and kept my face neutral. "I want to understand the HELOC," I said. "Dad mentioned you took out $75,000 against the house. I'm his daughter and I handle my own client's estate planning, so I have some questions about the structure." She looked at me for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes, not quite surprise, not quite alarm. Recalibration, maybe. "That's really between Jerry and me," she said, and her voice was warm, reasonable, the voice of a woman who understood that she was being challenged and had decided to respond by being utterly pleasant about it. "I know you're protective of him. That's beautiful, honestly. But we're married, Nadia. These are joint financial decisions. Whose name is on the HELOC? Both of ours. And the advisor, Dwight, is he a registered investment advisor? Does he have a fiduciary obligation?" The warmth didn't leave her face, but something behind it cooled by several degrees. "I'm not sure I understand why you're asking me these questions instead of asking your dad." "Because my dad told me to ask you," I said. It was a lie. A clean, specific, useful lie. I watched her process it. "Well," she said after a beat, "I'll have Dwight reach out to you if that would help. I'm sure he'd be happy to walk you through everything." I said that would be great. I kept my voice light. I thanked her for the water she hadn't offered me. I left. In my car, 2 blocks away, I finally let my hands shake. Just for about 30 seconds. Then I pulled out my phone and called the Ohio Division of Securities to ask how to look up a registered investment advisor named Dwight. There was no Dwight registered in Ohio with a fiduciary designation anywhere in the relevant categories. There was a Dwight Farrell in Columbus with a Series 65 license and 2 customer complaints on file, both settled. Not a fiduciary. A salesman with a license and a history of complaints. That was who had been advising my newly married 68-year-old father on what to do with his home equity. I sat with that information for 3 days. I didn't sleep well. I kept running the sequence. November wedding, 5 months of courtship, immediate movement on finances, HELOC, mystery document from a title company, a non-fiduciary advisor with complaints on file. Each piece alone was explainable. Together they formed a shape I recognized from client files I'd reviewed over the years, the shape of someone systematically repositioning assets before a situation changed. I called an attorney. Not a family attorney, not the guy who'd handled my divorce from Neil. I called a woman named Sylvia Okafor, who worked in Columbus and specialized in elder financial exploitation cases. I'd heard her name at a continuing education seminar 2 years earlier, and I'd kept the business card in my desk drawer because I hoped I would never need it. I needed it now. "Tell me what you have," Sylvia said. She didn't do pleasantries, which I respected immediately. I laid it out. The timeline, the HELOC, Dwight Farrell, the document I'd seen on the table, the prenuptial agreement that hadn't happened, the speed of the marriage. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Does your father have any documented cognitive decline?" she asked. "No, he's sharp, a little forgetful in the ordinary way of someone his age, but nothing clinical." "That complicates it," she said. "A competent adult can make his own financial decisions, even bad ones, even with a spouse who's influencing him. What we'd be looking for is whether there was misrepresentation, whether documents were altered or forged, whether assets are being moved in ways that could constitute fraud." She paused. "You said you saw a title company document. Do you remember which title company?" I did. I'd looked at it for maybe 4 seconds, but I remembered. First Meridian Title. I told her. "Okay," she said. "Here's what I want you to do. I want you to request a copy of the deed of trust on the Westerville property through the Franklin County Recorder's Office. It's public record. You can do it online. I want to see if anything's been recorded recently." I did it that night. The search took 11 minutes. What came back stopped my breathing for a moment. A deed of trust modification had been recorded 6 weeks earlier. The notary signature on the original deed, the one my parents had signed in 1987, had been referenced in the modification paperwork. And there, in the chain of title documents, was a loan modification form with a signature line that read, "Nadia R. Carver." I had never signed any loan modification on my father's house. I had never been asked to. I had never been a party to any transaction on that property in my life. I forwarded everything to Sylvia that night with a message that said simply, "I found it." She called me back within the hour. "This is fraud," she said. "Not maybe fraud, not we'd have to argue about it fraud. Someone forged your signature on a recorded document. That's a felony." She paused. "I need you to do something important before we go any further. I need you to get a certified copy of that modification from the recorder's office, the physical document with the raised seal, and I need you not to say a word to your father or Roxanne until we have it in hand." I said I understood. "And Nadia," she said, "I need you to think carefully about who else had access to your signature. Documents, forms you'd signed before, because whoever did this needed a sample." The notary appointment I'd made 2 months earlier, the power of attorney update. I'd come to the house to notarize. The forms I'd signed on the kitchen table, while Roxanne was in the next room getting coffee. I'd handed her exactly what she needed, and I hadn't even seen it happen. I drove to the Franklin County Recorder's Office when it opened at 8 the next morning, a Tuesday in late November. The sky the color of old concrete, the kind of Ohio morning that feels like the world is holding its breath. I stood at the counter and asked for the certified copy, and watched the clerk pull it up and print it and press the seal into the paper. And I held it with both hands and looked at my own name in someone else's pen and felt something happen in my chest that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite rage, but contained elements of both. On the drive home, I made one more call. Not to Sylvia, not to Petra, to my father's oldest friend, a man named Warren Chu, who had known Gerald Carver for 40 years, and who, as it happened, had been a fraud investigator for the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office for 22 of them before he retired. I'd met Warren at every Thanksgiving of my childhood. He taught me how to play chess when I was 9. He answered on the second ring. "Warren," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me exactly how bad it is." He listened. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How fast can you get to my house?" Warren lived 20 minutes from me, in a brick colonial in Gahanna that he'd owned since the early 90s. I'd been to that house for Christmas parties, for his wife Sandra's famous potato salad at summer cookouts, for an afternoon chess rematch when I was home from college, and convinced I'd finally gotten good enough to beat him. I hadn't. I pulled into his driveway at 9:40 in the morning, the certified copy from the recorder's office on the passenger seat in a manila envelope, and Warren was already standing in the open doorway with 2 mugs of coffee. He didn't hug me when I came in. He looked at my face, looked at the envelope, and said, "Come sit down." Sandra was visiting her sister in Pittsburgh, which meant the house had that particular quality of a space belonging entirely to one person. Warren's chess set on the side table, a legal pad already open on the kitchen counter, a pen laid across it at a precise angle. 40 years of habit. He sat across from me, took the certified copy out of the envelope with careful hands, and read it twice. The second time, he read it more slowly. "This is your signature line," he said, "not a question. I never signed anything on that property in my life." He set the document down flat on the table, smoothed it once with his palm, and looked at me. Warren Chu, at 71, was a compact, deliberate man who chose words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. Nothing unnecessary, nothing wasted. He had a face that had listened to a great many terrible things over 22 years without flinching, and it had settled into a permanent expression of careful attention. "You have an attorney," he said. "Sylvia Okafor. She specializes in elder financial exploitation." He nodded once. "I know Sylvia. She's excellent." He picked up his pen. "Tell me about the notary." "What notary?" "The one who witnessed the signature on this modification. Someone had to notarize it. That person either participated or was deceived. Either way, they're a thread." He turned the document over, found the notary stamp in the lower corner. "Ballard Notary Services, on Morse Road." I hadn't even looked at the notary stamp. I'd been so focused on my own name that I hadn't thought to look at who had certified it. Warren pulled the legal pad toward him and wrote the name down. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to call Sylvia this morning and tell her you've consulted with me. She'll know what that means. The 2 of you are going to file a complaint with the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office. Document forgery on a recorded real estate instrument is a felony in Ohio, 2nd degree. Simultaneously, you're going to want to file with the Ohio Division of Financial Institutions about the HELOC, because if the loan was obtained using a forged document, the bank has exposure, and they will cooperate fast." He paused. "The notary is the weak point in this. Whoever forged your signature needed a notary to certify it. That notary either didn't do their job or did something worse. Find out which." "And my father?" Warren looked at me for a moment. "Your father is the hardest part," he said quietly. "He didn't do anything wrong. He married someone he trusted, and that person used his trust. But he's going to feel implicated when this comes out, and he's going to feel foolish, and he may push back before he accepts it. You need to be ready for that." I drove home with my hands steady and my chest tight, and a list of action items running through my head like a ticker. I called Sylvia from my driveway and told her about Warren, told her about the notary stamp, told her I was ready to move. She said, "Good, I've already drafted the complaint. I'll add the notary information. We'll file Thursday." "What do I do about Roxanne in the meantime?" "Nothing," Sylvia said. "You do absolutely nothing that signals we know, because the moment she suspects, assets move. Cody potentially disappears. The $75,000 could be gone somewhere we can't reach it in 48 hours. I said I understood. I went inside, made a second pot of coffee, opened my laptop, and did something I was very good at. I worked. Not on the case, on actual client files, actual tax returns, the ordinary Tuesday work of a CPA in late November, because staying functional was the only thing I could control right now, and I had always controlled it by keeping my hands moving. Thursday came. Sylvia filed the complaint. The notary on Morse Road, a woman named Deborah Sisk, was contacted by the prosecutor's investigator the following Monday. As Warren had predicted, she was the weak point. According to what Sylvia told me later, Deborah Sisk had been approached by a man named Cody. She described him as quiet, polite, well-dressed, who had presented what appeared to be a complete document set and an ID for Nadia R. Carver. She had notarized it. She had not flagged anything because the ID had looked real. She cooperated fully and immediately because Deborah Sisk was not a criminal, just a notary who had been used by one, and she knew the difference between going down with a ship and getting clear of it. The ID had been fraudulent. Cody had obtained a fake Ohio driver's license in my name, walked into a notary's office with a forged document, and gotten it stamped. He had done this casually, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, like it was an errand. Warren, when I told him, just shook his head slowly and said, "They always think it's easier than it is." Sylvia moved to freeze the HELOC disbursements the same week the complaint was filed. The bank, Midwest Federal, where Dad had banked for 30 years, cooperated within 24 hours once they understood the forgery exposure. $41,000 of the $75,000 had already been disbursed, most of it to an account in Cody's name. $34,000 was frozen, I told my father on a Sunday. Not over the phone. I drove to Westerville, and I timed it for 11 in the morning because Roxanne had a standing Sunday yoga class that ran until noon. I'd noticed it mentioned on a class schedule I'd seen on the refrigerator 2 months earlier. I had 45 minutes, maybe 50. Dad was in the kitchen when I let myself in. He looked surprised and then pleased to see me, the way he always did, and that look, that unguarded, genuine pleasure, nearly broke me before I'd said a single word. I sat him down at the kitchen table. I put the certified copy in front of him. I walked him through it slowly, the way I would walk a client through a difficult audit finding, no emotion in my voice, just facts in sequence, letting the weight of each one settle before I added the next. The timeline, the HELOC, Dwight Farrell and his complaint history, the notary, Cody, the fake ID in my name. My father sat very still for a long time after I finished. The kitchen was quiet. The clock above the stove ticked. Outside, a neighbor's leaf blower started up and then stopped. "She seemed so," he started, and then didn't finish. "I know," I said. "I wasn't." Another stop. "I didn't know, Nadia." "I know you didn't," I said. "That's not what this is. This is not about what you did. This is about what she did." He put his hand over his eyes. He was 68 years old, and he had been married for 34 years to a woman who had never once made him feel like a mark. He was sitting in the kitchen of the house he and my mother had bought when I was a baby, and someone had put my forged name on a document in that house, and he hadn't known, and the fact that he hadn't known did not protect him from what it felt like to find out. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. We sat that way for a while. Roxanne came home at 12:15. She walked in through the garage door with her yoga mat under her arm and stopped when she saw me sitting at the table. She read the room in about 2 seconds, my father's face, the papers on the table, the specific quality of the silence, and something shifted behind her eyes. Not surprise, exactly, more like the look of someone who has been waiting for a particular thing and now sees it arriving. She set the yoga mat against the wall. She didn't sit down. "Nadia," she said, and her voice was still warm, still that practiced, seamless warmth. "I didn't know you were coming." "No," I said, "you didn't." I looked at her steadily. Sylvia Okafor filed a criminal complaint with the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office last Thursday. The notary has already given a statement. There's a freeze on the HELOC account, and there's a warrant in process for Cody. I let that sit for a moment. "I'm not here to give you a chance to explain. I'm here so that my father didn't have to hear any of this alone." Roxanne looked at my father. Something moved across her face, and I watched it carefully because I wanted to know if any of it was real. There might have been a flash of something genuine, some version of regret that wasn't entirely performance. Or it might have been the last calculated move of a woman who understood that the next few months would go better for her if she appeared remorseful. I genuinely couldn't tell. I filed it away as unknowable and moved on. "Jerry," she said softly. "Don't," my father said. One word, very quiet. He didn't look up from the table. She left the kitchen. I heard her on the stairs, then the sound of the guest room door. She'd been sleeping in the guest room for the past week, which I hadn't known but which Dad told me later, as if that detail had been important to him. She came back down 40 minutes later with 2 suitcases. She walked through the kitchen without stopping and out through the garage door, and I heard her car back out of the driveway, and then the sound of it faded down the street. Dad and I sat at the kitchen table for another hour. He made us sandwiches at some point, because that was what he did when he didn't know what else to do. He fed people. We ate them without talking much. At one point he said, "Your mother always said I was too trusting." And I said, "Mom also always said that was one of the things she loved most about you." And he was quiet for a long time after that. The legal process took the months it takes. Sylvia filed for an emergency protective order on the Westerville property, which was granted within the week. The divorce petition was filed in December. Roxanne, through her attorney, initially contested several things, then didn't, then agreed to terms that were substantially less favorable than she'd apparently been planning for. Cody was charged with identity fraud and forgery of a government instrument. He pleaded guilty in February and received 3 years of probation, a fine of $8,000, and a restitution order for the $41,000 that had already been dispersed, money that, as it turned out, had not entirely disappeared. Sylvia and a forensic accountant she brought in traced most of it to 2 accounts, one in Cody's name, and one in the name of an LLC he'd formed 6 months before the wedding. $33,000 of the $41,000 was eventually recovered. The remaining $8,000 was covered by the restitution order, payable over 24 months. Dwight Farrell was reported to the Ohio Division of Securities. His license was suspended pending investigation. I was not the only person who had filed a complaint about him, as it turned out. There were 4 others. I don't know how that ended for him specifically, but the pattern was on record, and patterns have a way of catching up. The divorce was finalized in March. 7 months of marriage, start to finish. The Westerville house remained in my father's name, encumbered by nothing, the HELOC closed and the equity intact. I moved my father to a smaller house in Clover Ridge the following June, not because he needed care, he didn't, not yet, but because he wanted to be closer, and because the Westerville house held more than he wanted to hold anymore. He found a 2-bedroom bungalow 4 streets away from me, and I helped him pack, and I did not cry until I was alone in my car in his new driveway, with the boxes unloaded and the keys handed over, and everything in its right place. Petra flew in for moving weekend.